Something safe and warm. The darkness around her enveloping her like a giant cocoon. So safe. So warm. Those same words repeating in a constant noise through the thick fog, always becoming lost to silence just before they reached her ears. A distant echo of something she knew would be impossible to find in this place, somewhere within reach. To think her own mind was the prison cell that held her behind iron bars, away from everything. Silence. The soft leaves of a tree brushing together, or the changing of bed sheets as the soft scent of lavender told her. A thick fog, choking her, was wrapped thickly around her body like saran wrap, this forcing her to think that she was suffocating. It was only the black that she could see. Remember? She knew she needed to remember something important, very important, but only teasing trails of faint memories came to her when she thought of what this important thing may be. Pretty dresses and blaring music, the sound of gravel under heels. Her heels? Yes, this was something definite in her still drifting mind. Soft lips and the slamming of a car door, and this is where it got fuzzy. The squealing of tires against asphalt. Eyes now snapping open, she realized that she could see again, the white walls, floor, and ceiling. This place was familiar, and yet not. As the smothering fog dispersed, the hospital echoed remotely in her head, and she focused hazy green eyes on the nurse who stood over her. The woman was looking down at her with wide eyes. Like a doe running from a wolf, she thought, still eyeing the nurse who began to speak in that same moment. The tones and resonance also came in muddled, and it took a moment for the underwater sound of the woman's voice to fade. "Lilith," the nurse called softly. Lilith lay still for a little longer, unsure whether she herself was real or if this was just a strange, dreamy illusion. "Lilith," the woman tried again, her voice soft, slightly rougher in tone this time. Grunting out in a reply of annoyance, Lilith blinked and tried to call back the darkness. She preferred it to the beep of machines and the irritating drone of the blonde nurse's voice. Even the dark was welcome at the moment, and anything was better than here. The here where her body was beginning to ache again from the morphine wearing off. The here where everything stopped and began again and was painful. The nurse, looking pleased, rushed away from the room even as Lilith lay there in her state of uncertainty. Her brain too colored with jumbled thoughts to make way for what she needed to remember. The hospital room, suddenly and thankfully empty except for her, smelled like disinfectant and rotten hospital food. But even the two strongest scents couldn't prepare her for the underlying smell of death mixed with formaldehyde. It was pungent and stuck in her nose like freezing fire, filling every cavity and expanding so it devoured her lungs as well. It was like choking on a corpse. Suddenly, as she tried to remember more, her hand shot up to her mouth in a horrified, silent scream, the IV in her arm pinching and pulling in her vein until it broke the skin and tore free, blood seeping from the wound. But the pain wasn't what mattered anymore. It was the memory. Suddenly, she was back in the passenger seat. The cool satin fabric of her formal dress bunched around the tops of her thighs on leather seats as she sat back in Dimitri's small car. He was staring at her, smiling wide, his mouth not quite moving with the words that she had heard. "Happy anniversary. I'll love you forever," the Dimitri voice said quietly. Dimitri's lips mouthed something else, and she smiled, knowing what it was, even as he placed the diamond on her ring finger, and she kissed his lips lovingly. The taste of him lingering on her tongue, even moments after they pulled out of the local club's parking lot and made their way to her house. Except they never made it home that night. They drove through deserted and busy streets alike towards the outskirts of town, her eyes continuously resting on his long, starless night sky black hair, his dark hazel eyes and the perfect curves of his face. Reaching out, she brushed a few soft strands of hair from his eyes and smiled as she sat back and saw the rush of headlights to her left. The street, so empty before, suddenly wasn't, and the SUV rammed straight into Dimitri's side of the car, but not before time had stopped long enough for Lilith to see the pained, loving look on his face. Her love, the one and only world in hers, crumpled sideways against her. The doors were forced inward, sending the car spinning around in a violent merry-go-round of metal and screaming tires. Then suddenly there was nothing at all but the crunch. Her eyes fluttered open again, and she saw Dimitri with his head against the steering wheel, his face turned towards her so she could see the blood in the corner of his mouth and his fogged, beautiful eyes. Lilith. He drew out her name, and she winced, hearing the hurt that he felt even before she saw the glass piercing the area under his collarbone. He drew in a ragged breath and smiled, his voice never matching his lips, as a tear, like the rain, she thought, with an odd sense of reality, ran down his bloody cheek and splashed on the glass, turning the blood a frosty pink. I love, he coughed again, blood splattering the spider-webbed windshield. You. Coughing again, the blood wound up in small sprinkles on her face as she tried to reach out to him, realizing her arms were trapped and entangled by the seatbelt. She opened her mouth to answer, say it was all right, and that she loved him too, but then the deafening thunder of an explosion outside of the car quieted her words and something slammed into the back of her head. Her last conscious thought was, he's going to die. Then the awful black overtook her and she woke up here. Here, with the old staring nurse and the ache all over her body. Lilith now thought she hated here. No, she didn't think she hated it. She loathed it with an intense passion. The warm blood that ran down her arm in a steady current began to stain the sheets, so she shifted, making it congeal on the tile floor beneath her. Losing so much blood could kill a person. That was surely obvious, but Lilith figured that finding Dimitri was far more important than worrying about the stream of life running from her arm. Ripping off the leftover medical tape, Lilith stood, her deceitful legs seeming to hold her weight, but still distrustfully shaky. So many things had happened at once, and it was a surprise the nurse hadn't come back yet. Surprise and pure luck. Knowing that she would in fact be back soon, Lilith hobbled to the open hospital door, leaving a shiny trail of blood droplets as she struggled along. Outside of the room, everything was quiet and entirely unlike the normal bustle of a busy hospital, with doctors all around the corners and a nurse every 5 feet. Instead, the blonde nurse stood at a counter with a sign attached to it, clearly marking it as the nurse's station. The nurse, whose name tag could be seen as she turned, deeming her to be Rosemary in bold lettering, acknowledged Lilith's presence and didn't so much as blink an eye at her blood-soaked left arm. Ah, Lilith, you're awake. Wonderful, Rosemary said in a melodically soft tone, clapping her hands together one time. The wavering on and off pain struck Lilith again, and she gripped her head, feeling it burn through her skin, muscle, and skull. It felt like somebody was shoving a hot branding iron into the back of her brain and stirring it around. Rosemary continued to smile, even as the enormous pain forced Lilith to noticeably wince and grip her head harder. Oh dear, that headache will pass. The older woman continued to smile while shuffling forward. Reaching out a slightly shaky, wrinkled hand, Rosemary ran it over Lilith's cheeks and sighed. It's horrible, isn't it? The way you have to see the world. Lilith eyed the woman wearily, the awful anguish slightly blurring her vision as she shifted her gaze. We all go through that when we arrive. It's what keeps us on our addiction-driven toes. Stomach churning, Lilith wanted straight answers to the nurse's words, but somehow in this unusual hospital, she doubted that she would receive any. I know. Now you want simple answers to all of my confusing words, Rosemary said. I understand. Well, to put it all simply, dearie, you're not really here. Your mind is, but your body is not. Still lost, Lilith felt her legs give way, but before she could collapse, she decided to sit on the smooth, white-tinted tiles. So, how do I get home? It was the first time she had heard her own voice since waking up, and it resounded in her head, cracked and exhausted, like it wasn't her voice at all, but that of an old woman decaying with age. The nurse's lips parted in a very small smile. You are home, she answered simply. Lilith's brow furrowed, further perplexed now. I don't understand, the old woman in her voice stated. Rosemary pointed to the room behind Lilith and then faded into the nearby corner, blending with the shadows. Thankfully, Lilith's arm had more or less stopped bleeding, and as she stood, the blood that had begun to pool around her started to fill the space from where she sat, as if filling in an unwanted, empty cavity. Shuffling ahead, Lilith could barely see into the dark. As much as she used to hate the fluorescent lighting that hospitals normally had, she found that this odd, shadowed place was much worse. Should have stayed lying in bed, she thought sourly. The hospital room Rosemary had pointed out was the same as Lilith's had been, except there was a large machine situated in the corner. The humming that came from the machine was comforting to Lilith, but she knew it didn't bode well for the inhabitant of the room. She recognized it as a respiratory machine, similar to the one that doctors had put her grandmother on after she had had a massive heart attack. It kept the patient's breathing stable. Quiet. Her footsteps were silent whispers on the cold floor as she approached the mound of blankets lying on the bed. Dimitri was there, unrecognizable to even Lilith, his face puffy and bruised. The hoses snaking in and out of his mouth and nose, allowing shallow, heart-rendingly labored breaths. Hands shaking, Lilith felt a hard metal chair at her back, and she sat slowly, her eyes never leaving the black and blue face of her fiancé. "Dimitri," she mouthed. She knew he couldn't hear her even if she had screamed his name, but Lilith guessed that didn't matter. It was the physical presence of her being beside him that did. Sitting and brooding over his state, she pushed the sleeves of her hospital gown up and over her shoulders, revealing the long, jagged scars that covered the soft flesh of her wrists and forearms. As she shifted her gaze, she ran her eyes over all of them, taking in each stretched mound of puckered flesh and thinking about how many times that she had almost sliced a vein. "You know," Lilith began, the old woman in her voice slightly giving way to her younger self. "I remember, before I met you, this was all I had." The right arm was the one she held up in the dim, blinking red eye of the respiratory machine, the blood-tinted light her only way to see in the darkness. "I felt like the pain would let me breathe a little, that maybe the cutting would bleed out all of the hurt I felt inside." Breathing deeply and listening hard to the whistling sound of the hose in Dimitri's nose, she tenderly ran a finger over the one scar that ran vertically up and down her arm, from her wrist to the fleshy inside of her elbow, scratching the flaking, dried blood from her skin. "A simple addiction of needing someone to keep me distracted from myself. This one scar nearly killed me. I missed my main artery by like centimeters." Lilith paused long enough to glance down at the floor, her story-enriched arm settling gently back into her lap. "I stopped cutting the first time I saw you. Before that, it had been a best friend. Before that, my grandmother." She stopped again. "I lost them both. So many people I've relied on to keep me safe from myself, but I could never keep them safe from the world." Lilith cleared her throat softly and shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the metal feeling too cold. "I guess that's why I didn't really feel it when I pulled the IV out of my arm." Her voice softened. "Old habits die hard." A low snicker floated through her words, and it was then that she decided to stand, leaning into the young man's washed-out face and kissing him gently on the forehead. "I love you." With that, she turned and eased the door shut behind her. That hypnotizing fog was back again, but this time, Lilith felt like it was pulling her in another direction. She followed this fog, allowing herself to slip into a fire escape door and down a few flights of stairs. The stairwell, only slightly lit by a single blinking bulb, seemed endless, just a continuous downward spiral of fading steps. Each time she proceeded forward, there was a crunch as leaves that were scattered on each step broke under her feet. When she finally reached the bottom, Lilith twisted the old brass handle of the door at the end of the stairs and opened it slowly, revealing a set of double doors leading into a large day room. The sign above the doors labeled it as the recovery unit. The fog pushed her towards the doors, and Lilith allowed herself to step into the room, tables and chairs scattered everywhere, with a few people dotted around as well. She knew what this place was. It was a room where they kept the severe recovering addicts in during the daytime. Lilith had been in one before, the only time that she'd been caught cutting, and just being in one again caused her to shiver violently. The door clicked shut behind her softly, and when Lilith turned to see why, Rosemary appeared beside her looking serious. "Well," the woman murmured. Blinking at her, Lilith shrugged and rolled down her sleeves while breathing deeply. "Over there is Dean McCarthy. He was a recovering alcoholic. He loved his drink a little bit more than he loved his own wife. One night, he came home, bottle in hand, and so drunk that he mistook her for a punching bag." Rosemary's voice wavered, and it became cold and serious. He hit her so hard he gave her a concussion and wound up here after she got sick of the beatings and gave him a taste of his own medicine during a storm one night. He had his chance to go home, but he chose wrong in the end." She turned to Lilith, who was staring at the pale-faced man sitting in the chair facing the corner. His brown hair was crew-cut, and his wide eyes were fixated on something that seemed to be very far away. The hospital gown he wore was filthy with grime and dirt. The room itself was lit only by the pale overhead lights that flashed on and off occasionally. No windows were seen, and it gave off a sense of utter desperation. These people, each with a story more horrific than the last, had failed to choose right in the end. Now, all of these people, not just McCarthy, are here forever. A pause, and then, if you don't choose right, you'll be stuck down here with them too. And so will he. Lilith's eyes widened in horror. "What?" she mumbled to the somber nurse. "What do you mean? Who is he?" Rosemary turned her eyes to Lilith, and it was the first time that she had realized the woman's eyes were a paralyzing ice blue. Predator's eyes, she thought darkly. Rosemary answered, "Dimitri. But if you don't learn what you need to and make your choice, you and him both will be stuck here forever. On the other hand, if you do go back to the physical world, he will die. You will live." Turmoil filled Lilith's eyes, and she scrunched her nose up, trying hard not to cry. "That's not fair," she whispered. Rosemary crossed her arms over her large chest and turned her eyes up to another man, this one rocking back and forth on the ground, mumbling quietly to himself. His white beard and hair was long enough to touch his chest, but his vibrant brown eyes seemed young and aware through the wrinkles on his face. His hospital gown, unlike McCarthy's, was entirely spotless. "John Greystone," Rosemary said. "He became so obsessed and addicted to his religion that he began to think he himself was God." "You're saying people can become addicted to God?" Lilith asked. "I'm saying that sometimes people need the comfort of faith in another person, or in his case, a higher deity, to think that they can survive." "So, I'm here because I'm addicted?" "Yes." With that final word, Rosemary walked into the center of the room and pointed at one more person, a woman who was standing at the opposite end of the room from Lilith. She was staring at a painting that was situated on the wall. It was of a wooden house, sitting beside a free-flowing creek in a forest. It was probably the only piece of art in this entire Purgatory. The woman's blonde hair ran like a sunlit river down her back and between her shoulder blades. Rosemary's face became undeniably distressed as she looked over this woman. "Rosehart, my own daughter," she muttered. Reaching out a hand but not quite touching the girl, it seemed as if none of the patients had any idea at all that Rosemary and Lilith were there, but something heavy that was in the room did. It felt like it was feeding off of the life force that Lilith had left, something that hadn't eaten for many years, at least since these people had arrived and failed their different tests. Easing towards Rosemary, Lilith watched the girl who just continued to stare, undeterred by her mother's presence. "She became addicted to saving me. She would stand in the rain holding the umbrella so I could stay dry. She stayed by my bedside at this hospital the day the doctor told me that I was dying. And after I died, she turned to drugs." Rosemary's eyes softened, and Lilith could swear that she was about to cry. The older woman shook it off and cleared her throat, turning her back on her daughter. "When she overdosed the first time, she went into a coma and found me in this place. The gatekeeper, of sorts, was what I became. I was put in a hospital bed for her test, and she was supposed to leave my side if she were to succeed. She didn't leave my side and failed. Now she has to stay here forever." Lilith nodded and became solemn as she spoke. "My test is to leave too, isn't it? I'm addicted to needing someone, and right now that's Dimitri. If I don't leave, we both are here forever, but if I do, I get a second chance, right?" Rosemary nodded, walking back towards the day room's entrance. "Dimitri dies if I leave, though." Another nod. This nod rattled Lilith as she closed her eyes tightly, wishing that it were all just a horrible nightmare. But that thing above them, the one feeding from her, told her that it was real. "It's because you were a cutter. You need to learn to rely on yourself rather than others. Help yourself, and you will succeed," Rosemary stated. A simple fact. Then she threw open the doors and left. Goodbye. I do hope you succeed, dear." Then she was gone. Lilith ran out the doors after her, but found that she was staring down the empty, shadowed hallway that held the door to her hospital room. "Help myself," Lilith said out loud. It was then that she noticed that she was staring at Dimitri's door as well as her own. Standing directly in the middle of both rooms, she reached out to her door, the sound of the respiratory machine in Dimitri's room in her ears. Then she withdrew and reached towards his door, then stopped again. Her addiction to needing someone blurring her decision into a giant whirl of colors. Then she noticed the scalpel clutched tightly in her fist, and she rolled up the sleeve of her left arm, rolling the sharp blade gently against the ball of her thumb as she considered her choices. Dimitri? Herself? Or ending it all? What Lilith didn't know was what the thing that was watching her did know. Even if she did leave, Dimitri wouldn't die. That was her test, letting him go so they could both live. That was Addiction, written by The Bone Collector. This has been another Unraveling with The Bone Collector. Stay spooky, kids.